Thanks for tuning in. Today we are reading Discours de la Méthode by René Descartes. Discours de la Méthode, or Discourse of the Method, outlines a systematic approach to acquiring knowledge based on reason and skepticism, famously stating, "I think, therefore I am." Descartes proposes a method involving clear and distinct reasoning, dividing problems into smaller parts, and progressing from simple to complex ideas. He also argues for the existence of God, the separation of mind and body, and critiques traditional scholastic education in favor of a new, rational approach to understanding the world. Discourse on Method by René Descartes. Common sense is the most widely shared thing in the world, for everyone thinks that he is so well provided with it, that even those who are the most difficult to please in all other things are not in the habit of desiring more than they have. In which it is not probable that all are mistaken, but rather it testifies that the power of judging well and distinguishing the true from the false, which is properly what is called good sense or reason, is naturally equal in all men, and so that the diversity of our opinions does not arise from the fact that some are more reasonable than others, but only from the fact that we conduct our thoughts by different ways, and do not consider the same things. For it is not enough to have a good mind, but the main thing is to apply it well. The greatest souls are capable of the greatest vices as well as of the greatest virtues, and those who walk very slowly can advance much more, if they always follow the right path, than do those who run and depart from it. For my part, I have never presumed that my mind was in any way more perfect than those of the common people. Indeed, I have often wished that my mind was as quick, or my imagination as clear and distinct, or my memory as ample or as present as some others. And I know of no qualities except those which serve for the perfection of the mind, for as for reason or sense, inasmuch as it is the only thing that makes us men and distinguishes us from beasts, I want to believe that it is entirely in one each one, and in this we must follow the common opinion of the philosophers, who say that there is no more and less except between accidents, and not between the forms or natures of individuals of the same species. But I will not hesitate to say that I think I have been very fortunate to have met from my youth in certain paths which have led me to considerations and maxims of which I have formed a method, by which it seems to me that I have the means of increasing my knowledge by degrees, and of raising it little by little to the highest point at which the mediocrity of my mind and the short duration of my life will be able to achieve. For I have already reaped such fruits, that although in the judgment I make of myself I always try to lean towards the side of distrust rather than that of presumption, and that, looking with a philosopher's eye at the various actions and undertakings of all men, there is scarcely one that does not seem to me vain and useless. I do not fail to receive extreme satisfaction from the progress I think I have already made in the search for truth, and to conceive such hopes for the future that if, among the occupations of men, purely men, there is one that is solidly good and important, I dare to believe that it is the one I have chosen. However, I may be mistaken, and it is perhaps only a little copper and glass that I take for gold and diamonds. I know how much we are liable to misunderstand what concerns us, and how suspicious also the judgments of our friends must be to us when they are in our favour. But I shall be very glad to show in this discourse what are the paths I have followed, and to represent my life as in a picture, so that every one may judge of it, and that, learning from the common rumour the opinions that will be held of it, it may be a new means of instructing me, which I will add to those I am accustomed to use. Thus my purpose is not to teach here the method which each one must follow in order to conduct his reason well, but only to show in what manner I have endeavoured to conduct mine. Those who meddle in giving precepts ought to consider themselves more skilful than those to whom they give them, and if they lack in the least thing they are blameworthy. But, proposing this work only as a story, or, if you prefer it, as a fable, in which, among some examples which may be imitated, there may also be found several others which it will be right not to follow. I hope that it will be useful to some without being injurious to anyone, and that all will be grateful to me for my frankness. I have been nourished in letters since my childhood, and because I was persuaded that by means of them one could acquire a clear and certain knowledge of all that is useful to life, I had an extreme desire to learn them. But as soon as I had completed all this course of study, at the end of which one is accustomed to be received into the rank of the learned, I entirely changed my opinion. For I found myself embarrassed by so many doubts and errors that it seemed to me that I had made no other profit in trying to inquire myself, except that I had discovered more and more my ignorance. And yet I was in one of the most famous schools in Europe, where I thought there must be learned men, if there were any in any part of the earth. I had learned there all that others learned there, and indeed, not having been satisfied with the sciences we were taught, I had perused all the books treating of those which are considered the most curious and the rarest, which had fallen into my hands. With this I knew the judgments that others made of me, and I did not see that I was esteemed inferior to my fellow students, although there were already some among them who were destined to fill the places of our masters. And finally, our century seemed to me as flourishing and as fertile in good spirits as any of the preceding ones had been, which made me take the liberty of judging by myself of all the others, and of thinking that there was no doctrine in the world that was such as I had previously been led to hope. I did not, however, fail to estimate the exercises in which they are engaged in the schools. I knew that the languages that are learned there are necessary for the understanding of ancient books, that the kindness of fables awakens the mind, that the memorable actions of histories raise it, and that, being read with discretion, they help to form judgment, that the reading of all good books is like a conversation with the most honest people of past centuries, who were the authors of them, and even a studied conversation in which they discover to us only the best of their thoughts, that eloquence has incomparable powers and beauties, that poetry has very ravishing delicacy and sweetness, that mathematics has very subtle inventions, which can serve much as to satisfy the curious as to facilitate all the arts and diminish the work of men, that the writings which treat of morals contain several teachings and exhortations to virtue which are very useful, that theology teaches us to gain heaven, that philosophy gives a means of speaking probably of all things, and of making oneself admired by the less learned, that jurisprudence, medicine, and the other sciences bring honours and riches to those who cultivate them, and finally that it is good to have examined them all, even the most superstitious and false, in order to know their true value and to guard against being deceived by them. But I thought I had already given enough time to languages, and even to the reading of ancient books and their histories and their fables, for it is almost the same to converse with those of other centuries as to travel. It is good to know something of the manners of various peoples, in order that we may judge of ours more soundly, and that we do not think that everything that is contrary to our fashions is ridiculous and unreasonable, as those who have seen nothing are wont to do. But when one employs too much time in travelling, one becomes at last a stranger in one's own country, and when one is too curious about the things that were practiced in past centuries, one usually remains very ignorant of those that were practiced in this one. Besides the fact that fables make us imagine several events as possible which are not, and that even the most faithful histories, if they do not change or increase the value of things to make them more worthy of being read, at least they almost always omit the lowest and least illustrious circumstances, whence it comes that the rest does not appear as it is, and that those who regulate their manners by the examples they draw from them are liable to fall into the extravagances of the paladins of our novels, and to conceive designs that exceed their strength. I esteemed eloquence very highly, and was in love with poetry, but I thought that both were gifts of the mind rather than fruits of study. Those who have the strongest reasoning and who best digest their thoughts in order to make them clear and intelligible can always best persuade what they propose, although they spoke only bas-breton, and had never learned rhetoric, and those who have the most agreeable inventions, and who know how to express them with the most ornament and sweetness, would not fail to be the best poets, even if the poetic art were unknown to them. I was especially fond of mathematics, on account of the certainty and evidence of their reasons, but I did not yet notice their true use. And, thinking that they were only used for the mechanical arts, I was astonished that their foundations being so firm and solid, nothing more elevated had been built on them. As, on the contrary, I compared the writings of the ancient pagans who treat of manners to very superb and magnificent palaces, which were built only on sand and mud. They raise the virtues very high, and make them appear estimable, above all things that are in the world. But they do not teach enough to know them, and often what they call by so beautiful a name is only insensibility, or pride, or despair, or parricide. I revered our theology, and pretended as much as any other to gain heaven, but having learned as a very certain thing that the way is no less open to the most ignorant than to the most learned, and that the revealed truths which lead to it are above our understanding, I would not have dared to submit them to the weakness of my reasonings. And I thought that, in order to undertake to examine them and to succeed in them, it was necessary to have some extraordinary assistance from heaven and to be more than a man. I will say nothing of philosophy, except that, seeing that it has been cultivated by the most excellent minds that have lived for several centuries, and that nevertheless there is as yet nothing in it that is not disputed, and consequently that is not doubtful, I had not enough presumption to hope to meet with it better than the others. And that, considering how many different opinions may be held on the same subject by learned men, without there ever being more than one that is true, I almost repudiated as false everything that was only probable. Then, as for the other sciences, inasmuch as they borrow their principles from philosophy, I judged that nothing could have been built that was solid on such loose foundations, and neither the honour nor the gain they promise were sufficient to invite me to learn them, for I did not feel, thank God, any condition that would oblige me to make a profession of science for the relief of my fortune. And, although I did not profess to despise glory as a cynic, I nevertheless made very little allowance for that which I did not hope to be able to acquire except by false titles. And finally, as to bad doctrines, I thought I knew enough of what they were worth, to be no longer subject to be deceived either by the promises of an alchemist, or by the predictions of an astrologer, or by the impostures of a magician, or by the artifices or boasting of any of those who profess to know more than they know. Therefore, as soon as age permitted me to leave the subjection of my tutors, I gave up the study of letters entirely, and resolving to seek no other science than that which could be found in myself, or in the great book of the world, I employed the rest of my youth in travelling, in seeing courts and armies, in associating with people of various moods and conditions, in collecting various experiences, in testing myself in the encounters that fortune proposed to me, and everywhere to make such a reflection on the things that presented themselves that I might derive some benefit from them. For it seemed to me that I could find much more truth in the reasonings that each one makes concerning the affairs that are important to him, and of which the event must punish him soon afterwards if he has misjudged, than in those made by a man of letters in his study touching speculations that produce no effect, and which are of no other consequence to him, except that perhaps he will derive from them all the more vanity as they are more distant from common sense, because he will have had to employ all the more wit and artifice in trying to make them probable. And I had always an extreme desire to learn to distinguish the true from the false, in order to see clearly in my actions, and to walk with confidence in this life. It is true that while I was only considering the manners of other men, I found little to assure myself, and that I noticed almost as much diversity as I had before made between the opinions of philosophers. So that the greatest profit I derived from it was that, seeing many things which, although they seem to us very extravagant and ridiculous, do not fail to be commonly received and approved by other great nations, I learned not to believe too firmly anything that had only been persuaded to me by example and custom. And thus I delivered myself little by little from many errors which may offend our natural light and render us less capable of understanding reason. But after I had employed some years in studying thus in the book of the world, and in endeavouring to acquire some experience, I resolved one day to study also within myself, and to employ all the forces of my mind in choosing the paths I should follow, which I think is much more successful than if I had never strayed from my country or my books. Part 2. I was then in Germany, whither the occasion of the wars, which are not yet over, had called me, and as I was returning from the coronation of the Emperor to the army, the beginning of winter stopped me in a quarter, where, finding no conversation to amuse me, and having, moreover, fortunately, no cares or passions to disturb me, I remained all day shut up alone in a stove, where I had plenty of leisure to converse with my thoughts. Among which one of the first was that I took it into my head to consider that there is often not so much perfection in works composed of several pieces, and made by the hand of different masters, as in those in which only one has worked. Thus we see that the buildings which a single architect has undertaken and completed are accustomed to be more beautiful and better ordered than those which many have endeavoured to mend by making use of old walls which had been built for other purposes. Thus these ancient cities, which, having been at first only villages, have become by succession of time great cities, are usually so badly compensated, at the cost of those regular places which an engineer traces at his fancy in a plain, that although considering their buildings each apart, one often finds as much or more art there than in those of the others, however, to see how they are arranged, here a large one, there a small one, and how they make the streets curved and uneven, one would say that it was rather fortune than the will of a few men using reason that disposed them in this way. And if we consider that there have always been some officers who have been responsible for taking care of the buildings of private individuals to make them serve for the ornament of the public, we will know that it is difficult, by working only on the works of others, to do things that are very accomplished. Thus I imagined that the peoples who, having formerly been semi-savages, and having become civilized only by degrees, have made their laws only in proportion as the inconvenience of crimes and quarrels has compelled them to do so, could not be so well policed as those who, from the beginning that they assembled, have observed the constitutions of some prudent legislator. As it is quite certain that the state of true religion, of which God alone has made the ordinances, must be incomparably better regulated than all the others. And to speak of human affairs, I believe that if Sparta was formerly very flourishing, it was not because of the goodness of each of its laws in particular, seeing that many were very strange, and even contrary to good morals, but because, having been invented by only one, they all served the same purpose. And so I thought that the sciences of books, at least those whose reasons are only probable, and which have no demonstrations, having been composed and enlarged little by little by the opinions of several different persons, are not so near to the truth as the simple reasonings which a man of good sense can naturally make concerning the things that present themselves. And so again I thought that because we were all children before we were men, and because we had to be governed for a long time by our appetites and our preceptors, which were often contrary to each other, and which neither of them perhaps always advised us to do the best, it is almost impossible that our judgment should be so pure and so solid as they would have been if we had had the entire use of our reason from the moment of our birth, and that we should never have been guided by it alone. It is true that we do not see that all the houses in a city are thrown down for the sole purpose of rebuilding them in another way and making the streets more beautiful. But it is clear that many have their own pulled down in order to rebuild them, and that sometimes they are even forced to do so when they are in danger of falling of themselves and the foundations of them are not very firm. By the example of which I persuaded myself that there would really be no appearance that a private individual would make a design to reform a state, by changing everything from the foundations, and by overthrowing it to straighten it out, nor even to reform the body of the sciences or the order established in the schools for the teaching of them. But that, for all the opinions which I had hitherto received in my belief, I could not do better than to undertake once and for all to remove them, in order to put back afterwards either other better, or else the same when I adjusted them to the level of reason. And I firmly believed that by this means I should succeed in leading my life much better than if I built only on old foundations, and relied only on the principles which I had allowed myself to be persuaded in my youth, without ever having examined whether they were true. For, although I noticed various difficulties in this, they were not without remedy, nor comparable to those which are found in the reformation of the least things that affect the public. These great bodies are too difficult to raise when they are cast down, or even to hold back when they are shaken, and their falls can only be very severe. Then, as for their imperfections, if they have any, as the mere diversity that exists between them is sufficient to ensure that several have them, usage has doubtless greatly softened them, and even avoided or insensibly corrected a quantity which could not be so well provided for by prudence, and finally they are almost always more bearable than their change would be. In the same way as the great roads which wind between mountains gradually become so smooth and so convenient, by dint of being frequented, that it is much better to follow them than to undertake to go straighter, climbing above the rocks and descending to the bottom of the precipices. That is why I can in no way approve of those muddled and restless moods which, being called neither by their birth nor by their fortune to the management of public affairs, do not fail to make some new reformation in their minds, and if I thought that there was anything in this writing by which I could be suspected of this folly, I should be very sorry to suffer it to be published. Never has my design extended farther than to try to reform my own thoughts, and to build on a fund that is entirely mine. If my work has pleased me enough, I show you here the model. It is not, for that reason, that I wish to advise anyone to imitate it. Those whom God has better shared with his graces will perhaps have more lofty designs, but I am afraid that this one is already too bold for many. The mere resolution to get rid of all the opinions which one has previously received in one's belief is not an example which everyone ought to follow, and the world is almost composed of only two kinds of minds to which it is in no way suitable, namely, those who, believing themselves to be more clever than they are, cannot help precipitating their judgments, nor have patience enough to direct all their thoughts in order, whence it comes that, if they had once taken the liberty of doubting the principles they have received, and to deviate from the common path, they would never be able to keep the path that must be taken to go straighter, and would remain lost all their lives. And then of those who, having reason or modesty enough to judge that they are less capable of distinguishing the true from the false than some others by whom they may be instructed, ought rather to be content with following the opinions of these others than to seek better ones themselves. And for my part, I should doubtless have been one of the latter, if I had never had but one master, or had not known the differences which have always existed between the opinions of the most learned. But having learned, as early as the college, that nothing so strange and so unbelievable could be imagined that it had not been said by one of the philosophers, and since then, while travelling, having recognized that all those who have sentiments very contrary to ours are not for that reason barbarous or savage, but that many use reason as much or more than we do, and having considered how different the same man, with the same mind, being nourished from his childhood between Frenchmen and Germans, becomes from what he would be if he had always lived among Chinese or cannibals, and how, even in the fashions of our clothes, the same thing that pleased us 10 years ago, and which will perhaps please us for 10 years to come, now seems to us extravagant and ridiculous, so that it is much more custom and example that persuade us, than any certain knowledge, and that nevertheless the plurality of voices is not a proof that is worth anything, for truths that are a little difficult to discover, because it is much more probable that a single man has encountered them than a whole people. I could choose no one whose opinions seemed to me to be preferred to those of others, and I found myself, as it were, obliged to undertake to conduct myself. But, like a man who walks alone and in darkness, I resolved to go so slowly and to use so much circumspection in all things that if I advanced very little, I would at least take care not to fall. I did not even wish to begin to reject altogether any of the opinions which might have formerly crept into my belief without having been introduced into it by reason, until I had first employed sufficient time in making the project of the work I undertook, and in seeking the true method of arriving at the knowledge of all the things of which my mind was capable. I had studied a little when I was younger between the parts of philosophy in logic and between mathematics in the analysis of geometers and in algebra, 3 arts or sciences which seemed likely to contribute something to my design. But in examining them, I took care that, in the case of logic, its syllogisms and most of its other instructions serve rather to explain to others the things one knows, or even, like the art of lull, to speak without judgment of those one does not know than to learn them, and though it contains many very true and good precepts, yet there are so many others mingled among them which are either harmful or superfluous, that it is almost as difficult to separate them as it is to draw a Diana or Minerva out of a block of marble that is not yet sketched. Then, for the analysis of the ancients and the algebra of the moderns, besides the fact that they extend only to very abstract subjects which seem to be of no use, the former is always so constrained to the consideration of figures that it cannot exercise the understanding without greatly tiring the imagination. And we have so subjected ourselves in the last year to certain rules and figures that we have made of them a confused and obscure art that embarrasses the mind, instead of a science that cultivates it. This was the cause of my thinking that it was necessary to seek some other method, which, understanding the advantages of these 3, would be free from their defects. And as the multitude of laws often furnishes excuses for vices, so that a state is much better regulated when, having but very few, they are very closely observed. Therefore, instead of the great number of precepts of which logic is composed, I thought I should have enough of the following 4, provided I took a firm and constant resolution not once to fail to observe them. The first was never to accept anything as true until I evidently knew it to be so, that is to say, to carefully avoid precipitation and precaution, and to comprehend nothing more in my judgments than what would present itself so clearly and distinctly to my mind that I had no occasion to doubt it. The second, to divide each of the difficulties I would examine into as many parcels as it could, and as would be required to better solve them. The third, to conduct my thoughts in order, beginning with the simplest and easiest objects to know, to ascend little by little, as if by degrees, to the knowledge of the most compound, and even supposing order between those which do not naturally precede each other. And the last, to keep silent everywhere such complete enumerations and reviews so general that I was assured of omitting nothing. These long chains of reasons, all simple and easy, which geometers are accustomed to use to arrive at their most difficult demonstrations, had given me occasion to imagine that all things that can fall under the knowledge of men are intertwined in the same way, and that, provided only that we refrain from receiving any of them as true, that is not so. And let us always keep the order necessary to deduce them from each other. There can be none so distant to which we do not arrive, nor so hidden that we do not discover. And I was not much troubled to inquire with which it was necessary to begin, for I already knew that it was with the simplest and easiest to know. And, considering that among all those who have previously sought truth in the sciences, there have been only the mathematicians who have been able to find some demonstrations, that is to say, some certain and obvious reasons, I do not doubt that it was by the same ones that they have examined, although I did not expect any other use from them, except that they would accustom my mind to feast on truths, and not be satisfied with false reasons. But I did not intend to try to learn all those particular sciences which are commonly called mathematics. And seeing that, although their objects are different, they do not fail to agree with each other, in that they consider nothing else than the various relations or proportions which are found in them, I thought it better that I should examine these proportions only in general, and without supposing them, except in those subjects which would serve to make it easier for me to know them, even without in any way compelling them to do so, in order to be able to apply them all the better afterwards to all the others to which they would be suitable. Then, having taken care that in order to know them I should sometimes need to consider each one in particular, and sometimes only to retain them, or to understand them several together, I thought that, in order to consider them better in particular, I ought to suppose them in lines, because I could find nothing simpler, nor that I could represent more distinctly to my imagination and my senses. But that, in order to retain them, or to understand them several together, it was necessary that I should explain them by a few figures as short as possible, and that, by this means, I would borrow all the best of geometrical analysis and algebra, and correct all the defects of the one by the other. As indeed I dare say that the exact observance of these few precepts which I had chosen gave me such facility in disentangling all the questions to which these two sciences extend, that in the 2 or 3 months that I employed in examining them, having begun with the simplest and most general, and each truth that I found being a rule which served me afterwards to find others. Not only did I overcome several which I had formerly judged very difficult, but it seemed to me also towards the end that I could determine, even in those of which I was ignorant, by what means and how far it was possible to solve them. In which I may not seem to you to be very vain, if you consider that, having only one truth of each thing, whoever finds it knows as much as can be known. And that, for example, a child instructed in arithmetic, having made an addition according to his rules, may be assured of having found, concerning the sum he was examining, all that the human mind could find. For in short, the method, which teaches to follow the true order, and to enumerate exactly all the circumstances of what one seeks, contains everything that gives certainty to the rules of arithmetic. But what satisfied me most with this method was that by it I was assured of using my reason in everything, if not perfectly, at least the best in my power. Besides that, I felt in practicing it that my mind was gradually accustomed to conceive its objects more clearly and distinctly, and that, not having subjected it to any particular subject, I promised myself to apply it as usefully to the difficulties of the other sciences as I had done to those of algebra. Not that for this reason I dared to undertake first to examine all those that presented themselves, for that would have been contrary to the order which it prescribes. But, having taken care that their principles were all to be borrowed from philosophy, in which I did not yet find any certainty, I thought that I must first of all endeavour to establish them there, and that, this being the most important thing in the world, and in which precipitation and precaution were most to be feared, I ought not to undertake to come to an end until I had attained an age much more mature than that of 23 years which I then was, and had before employed a great deal of time in preparing myself for it, both by uprooting from my mind all the bad opinions I had received there before that time, as by making a heap of several experiments in order to be after the matter of my reasonings, and by always exercising myself in the method I had prescribed for myself in order to strengthen myself more and more in it. Part 3. And finally, as it is not enough, before beginning to rebuild the dwelling in which one lives, to pull it down and to stock up on materials and architects, or to practice architecture oneself. And besides that, to have carefully drawn a design of it, but that one must also have provided oneself with some other where one can be comfortably lodged during the time that one will be working there. Thus, in order that I might not remain irresolute in my actions, while reason obliged me to be so in my judgments, and that I might not cease to live from then on as happily as I could, I formed for myself a morality by provision, which consisted only of 3 or 4 maxims of which I am willing to share with you. The first was to obey the laws and customs of my country, constantly retaining the religion in which God has given me the grace to be instructed from my childhood, and governing myself in all other things according to the most moderate opinions and the most remote from excess, which were commonly received in practice by the most sensible of those with whom I had to live. For, beginning from that time to count my own for nothing, because I wished to put them all back to the examination, I was assured of being able to do no better than to follow those of the most sensible. And though there may be some as sensible among the Persians or Chinese as among us, it seemed to me that the most useful thing was to regulate myself according to those with whom I should have to live. And that, in order to know what their opinions really were, I ought rather to take care of what they practiced than what they said. Not only because in the corruption of our morals there are few people who will say all that they believe, but also because many are ignorant of it themselves, for the action of the thought by which we believe a thing being different from that by which we know that we believe it, they are often one without the other. And among several opinions equally received, I chose only the most moderate, both because they are always the most convenient for practice, and probably the best, all excesses being accustomed to be bad. As also in order to divert myself less from the true path, in case I failed, than if, having chosen one of the extremes, it would have been the other that would have had to be followed. And particularly I placed among excesses all the promises by which one takes something away from one's liberty. Not that I disapprove of the laws which, to remedy the inconstancy of weak minds, permit, when one has some good design, or even, for the safety of commerce, some design that is only indifferent, to make vows or contracts that oblige one to persevere in them, but because I saw no thing in the world that always remained in the same state, and that for my own sake, I promised myself to perfect my judgments more and more, and not to make them worse. I should have thought myself committing a great fault against common sense, if for that I approved of something at the time, I had obliged myself to take it for good still afterwards, when it had perhaps ceased to be so, or that I had ceased to esteem him as such. My second maxim was to be as firm and resolute in my actions as I could, and not to follow the most doubtful opinions any less constantly when I had once determined to do so, than if they had been very assured, imitating in this respect the travellers, who, finding themselves lost in some forest, must not wander now and round now to one side, now to another, much less to stop in one place, but always walk as straight as they can towards the same side, and not change it for feeble reasons, although it may have been at first only chance that determined them to choose it. For by this means, if they do not go precisely where they wish, they will at least arrive at the end somewhere where they are likely to be better than in the middle of a forest. And so the actions of life often admit of no delay. It is a very certain truth that, when it is not in our power to discern the truest opinions, we must follow the most probable, and even though we do not perceive any more probability in the one than in the other, we must nevertheless determine ourselves to some of them and consider them afterwards, no longer as doubtful in so far as they relate to practice, but as very true and very certain, because the reason which has led us to determine them is found to be such. And this was then able to deliver me from all the repentance and remorse which are wont to agitate the consciences of those weak and tottering minds who inconstantly indulge themselves in practicing as good those things which they judge afterwards to be bad. My third maxim was to endeavour always rather to conquer myself than fortune, and to change my desires than the order of the world, and generally to accustom myself to believe that there is nothing entirely in our power but our thoughts, so that after we have done our best with regard to things external to us, everything that fails to succeed us is absolutely impossible in our eyes. And this alone seemed to me to be sufficient to prevent me from desiring anything in the future that I did not acquire, and thus to make me content, for as our will is naturally inclined to desire only those things which our understanding in some way represents to it as possible, it is certain that if we consider all the goods that are outside us as equally remote from our power, we will have no more regret at wanting those which seem to be due to our birth, when we shall be deprived of them through no fault of our own, which we have for not possessing the kingdoms of China or Mexico. And that, as they say, we will no more desire to be healthy when sick, or to be free while in prison, than we do now to have bodies of a matter as incorruptible as diamonds, or wings to fly like birds. But I confess that it is necessary to have a long exercise and an often repeated meditation, to accustom oneself to look at all things from this angle. And I believe that it was chiefly in this that the secret of those philosophers who were formerly able to withdraw themselves from the empire of fortune, and, in spite of sorrows and poverty, to dispute for happiness with their gods. For being incessantly occupied in considering the limits prescribed to them by nature, they were so perfectly persuaded that nothing was in their power but their thoughts, that this alone was sufficient to prevent them from having any affection for other things, and they disposed of them so absolutely that they had some reason to consider themselves richer and more powerful, and freer and happier than any of the other men, who, not having this philosophy, however favoured by nature and fortune they may be, never dispose of all they want. Finally, to conclude this morality, I took it into my head to make a review of the various occupations that men have in this life, in order to try to choose the best. And, without wishing to say anything about those of others, I thought that I could not do better than to continue in the very one in which I found myself, that is to say, to employ all my life in cultivating my reason, and to advance as far as I could in the knowledge of the truth, according to the method I had prescribed for myself. I had experienced such extreme contentment since I had begun to use this method that I did not believe that any sweeter or more innocent could be received in this life. And discovering every day by means of him some truths which seemed to me of great importance and commonly unknown to other men, the satisfaction I had of them so filled my mind that all the rest did not affect me. Besides the fact that the three preceding maxims were founded only on the design I had of continuing to instruct myself, for God having given each of us some light to discern the true from the false, I should not have thought it my duty to be satisfied with the opinions of others for a single moment. If I had not proposed to employ my own judgment in examining them when the time came, and I would not have been able to exempt myself from scruples in following them. If I had not hoped to lose no opportunity of finding better ones in case there were any, and finally, I should not have been able to limit my desires or be content. If I had not followed a path by which, thinking that I should be assured of the acquisition of all the knowledge of which I should be capable, I thought myself by the same means that of all the true goods that would ever be in my power. All the more because, since our will is not inclined to follow or flee from anything except according to whether our understanding represents it to be good or bad, it is enough to judge well to do well, and to judge as well as we can to do all our best, that is to say, to acquire all the virtues, and together all the other goods that we can acquire, and when one is certain that this is so, one cannot fail to be satisfied. Having thus assured myself of these maxims, and having set them apart with the truths of faith, which have always been the first in my belief, I judged that for all the rest of my opinions I might freely undertake to get rid of them. And as I hoped to be able to get rid of it better by conversing with men than by remaining any longer shut up in the stove, where I had had all these thoughts, the winter was not yet over when I began to travel again. And in all the 9 years that followed, I did nothing but roll here and there in the world, trying to be a spectator rather than an actor in all the comedies that were played there, and reflecting particularly in each matter on what might render it suspect and give us occasion to misunderstand. I nevertheless uprooted from my mind all the errors that had crept into it before. Not that I imitated the skeptics, who doubt only for the sake of doubting and affect to be always irresolute. For on the contrary, my whole design was only to secure myself, and to throw away the moving earth and the sand to find rock or clay. Which succeeded me, it seems to me, well enough, especially as, endeavouring to discover the falsity or uncertainty of the propositions which I examined, not by feeble conjectures, but by clear and certain reasonings, I did not meet with one so doubtful that I did not always draw some conclusion from it with some certainty, if it had only been for the very fact that it contained nothing certain. And as, in pulling down an old dwelling, one usually reserves the demolitions to serve to build a new one, so, by destroying all those of my opinions which I judged to be ill-founded, I made various observations and acquired several experiments which have since served me to establish more certain ones. And moreover, I continued to practice myself in the method I had prescribed for myself, for, besides taking care to conduct all my thoughts generally according to the rules, I reserve for myself from time to time a few hours, which I particularly employed in practising it in difficulties of mathematics, or even in some others which I could render almost similar to those of mathematics, by detaching them from all the principles of the other sciences which I did not find firm enough, as you will see that I have done in several which are explained in this volume 33. And so, without living in any other way in appearance than those who, having no employment but to pass a sweet and innocent life, study to separate pleasures from vices, and who, in order to enjoy their leisure without being bored, make use of all the amusements that are on it, I did not cease to pursue my purpose and to profit in the knowledge of the truth, perhaps more than if I had only read books or frequented men of letters. These 9 years, however, elapsed before I had yet taken any part concerning the difficulties which are accustomed to be disputed among the learned, nor begun to seek the foundations of any philosophy more certain than the vulgar. And the example of several excellent minds who, having had the design before, seemed to me not to have succeeded in it, made me imagine so much difficulty that I should not have dared to undertake it so soon, if I had not seen that some of them were already spreading the rumour that I had come to an end. I cannot say on what they base this opinion, and if I have contributed anything to it by my discourses, it must have been by confessing more ingenuously what I did not know, than those who have studied a little are accustomed to do, and perhaps also by showing the reasons I had for doubting many things which others consider certain, rather than by boasting of any doctrine. But having a heart good enough not to wish to be taken for anything other than I was, I thought it necessary that I should endeavour by all means to make myself worthy of the reputation I was given. And it is just 8 years since this desire made me resolve to remove myself from all places where I could have any acquaintance, and to retire here, to a country where the long duration of the war has caused such orders to be established that the armies which are maintained there seem to serve only to ensure that the fruits of peace may be enjoyed there with all the more security, and where, among the crowd of a great people, very active and more careful of their own affairs than curious about those of others, without wanting in any of the comforts that are in the most frequented cities, I have been able to live as solitary and retired as in the most remote deserts. Part 4. I do not know whether I ought to speak to you of the first meditations I made on it, for they are so metaphysical and so uncommon that they will perhaps not be to the taste of everybody. And yet, in order that it may be judged whether the foundations I have taken are firm enough, I find myself in some way obliged to speak of them. I had long remarked that in the case of morals, it is sometimes necessary to follow opinions which are known to be very uncertain, as if they were indubitable, as has been said above, but because I then wished to devote myself only to the search for the truth, I thought it necessary that I should do the very opposite, and that I should reject as absolutely false everything in which I could imagine the least doubt, in order to see if there would not remain after that something in my belief that was entirely indubitable. Thus, because our senses sometimes deceive us, I wish to suppose that there was no thing that was such as they make us imagine it, and because there are men who misunderstand in reasoning, even concerning the simplest subjects of geometry, and make paralogisms about them, judging that I was as apt to fail as any other, I rejected as false all the reasons I had previously taken for demonstrations, and, finally, considering that all the same thoughts that we have when awake may also come to us when we are asleep, without any of them being true at that time, I resolved to pretend that all the things that had ever entered my mind were no more true than the illusions of my dreams. But immediately afterwards I took care that, while I wanted to think that everything was false, it was necessary that I, who thought it, should be something. And observing that this truth, I think therefore I am, was so firm and so assured, that all the most extravagant suppositions of the sceptics were not capable of shaking it, I judged that I might receive it without scruple for the first principle of philosophy which I sought. Then, examining attentively what I was, and seeing that I could pretend that I had no body, and that there was no world or place where I was, but that I could not pretend that I was not, and that contrary to the very fact that I thought of doubting the truth of other things, it followed very evidently and most certainly that I was. Whereas if I had only ceased to think, all the rest of what I had ever imagined had been true. I had no reason to believe that I should have been. I knew from this that I was a substance whose whole essence or nature is only to think, and which in order to exist needs no place or depends on any material thing, so that this self, that is to say, the soul by which I am what I am, is entirely distinct from the body. And even that it is easier to know than the body, and that even if it were not, it could not have been so to be all that it is. After this I considered in general what is required of a proposition to be true and certain, for since I had just found one which I knew to be such, I thought that I ought also to know in what this certainty consists. And having observed that there is nothing at all in this, I think, therefore I am, who assures me that I speak the truth, except that I see very clearly that in order to think one must be. I judged that I might take as a general rule that the things which we conceive very clearly and distinctly are all true, but that there is only some difficulty in clearly noticing which are those which we distinctly conceive. Wherefore, reflecting on what I doubted, and that consequently my being was not altogether perfect, for I saw clearly that it was a greater perfection to know than to doubt, I took it into my head to inquire whence I had learned to think of something more perfect than I was, and I evidently knew that it must be of some nature which was indeed more perfect. As for the thoughts I had of many other things outside of myself, such as heaven, earth, light, heat, and 1,000 others, I was not so much at a loss to know whence they came, because, noticing nothing in them that seemed to me to make them superior to me, I could believe that, if they were true, they were dependencies of my nature, in so far as it had some perfection, and, if they were not, that I had them from nothing, that is to say, that they were in me because I had defects. But this could not be the same with the idea of a being more perfect than mine, for to hold it from nothingness was a thing manifestly impossible. And because there is no less repugnance that the most perfect should be a consequence and dependence of the less perfect, than that from nothing proceeds something, nor could I have it from myself, so that it remained that it had been put into me by a nature which was really more perfect than I was, and even which had in itself all the perfections of which I could have some idea, that is to say, to explain myself in a word, which was God. To which I added that, since I knew some perfections which I did not possess, I was not the only being who existed. I will use, if you please, hear freely the words of the school, but that it was necessary that there should be some more perfect one, on whom I depended, and on whom I should have acquired all that I had. For if I had been alone and independent of all others, so that I might have had of myself all the little that I partook of the perfect being, I might have had of myself, for the same reason, all the surplus that I knew I lacked, and thus be myself infinite, eternal, immutable, all-knowing, all-powerful, and, in short, have all the perfections that I could observe to be in God. For, according to the reasonings I have just made, in order to know the nature of God, as far as my own was capable, I had only to consider of all the things of which I found some idea in me, whether it was perfection or not to possess them, and I was assured that none of those which marked any imperfection was in him, but that all the others were. As I saw that doubt, inconstancy, sorrow, and the like could not be there, seeing that I myself would have been very easy to be exempt from them. Then, besides this, I had ideas of several sensible and corporeal things, for, though I supposed that I saw again, and that all that I saw or imagined was false, yet I could not deny that the ideas of it were really in my mind. But because I had already known in myself very clearly that the intelligent nature is distinct from the corporeal, considering that every composition testifies to dependence, and that dependence is manifestly a defect, I judged from this that it could not be a perfection in God to be composed of these two natures, and that consequently it was not, but that if there were any bodies in the world, or any intelligences or other natures which were not all perfect, their being must depend on his power, so that they could not subsist without him for a single moment. After this I wished to seek other truths, and having proposed to myself the object of the geometers, which I conceived as a continuous body, or a space indefinitely extended in length, breadth, and height or depth, divisible into various parts which might have various figures and magnitudes, and be moved or transposed in all kinds, for geometers suppose all this to be their object, I went through some of their simplest demonstrations, and having taken care that this great certainty, which everyone attributes to them, is founded only on what is evidently conceived of them, according to the rule I have just stated, I also took care that there was nothing at all in them to assure me of the existence of their object. For example, I saw clearly that, supposing a triangle, it was necessary that its 3 angles should be equal to 2 right angles. But I saw nothing for that reason to assure me that there was no triangle in the world, whereas, returning to examining the idea I had of a perfect being, I found that existence was included in it in the same way as it is understood in that of a triangle that its 3 angles are equal to 2 right angles, or in that of a sphere that all its parts are equally distant from its centre, or even more obviously. And that consequently it is at least as certain that God, who is this being so perfect, is or exists as any demonstration of geometry could be. But what makes many who persuade themselves that there is difficulty in knowing it, and even in knowing what their soul is that they never raise their minds beyond sensible things, and that they are so accustomed to consider nothing except by imagining it, which is a particular way of thinking for material things, that everything that is unimaginable seems to them not to be intelligible. This is sufficiently manifest from the fact that even the philosophers hold it as a maxim in the schools, that there is nothing in the understanding which has not been at first in the sense where, however, it is certain that the ideas of God and of the soul have never been. And it seems to me that those who wish to use their imagination to understand them do all the same as if, in order to hear sounds or smell smells, they wish to use their eyes, except that there is still this difference, that the sense of sight assures us no less of the truth of its objects than those of smell or hearing do, whereas neither our imagination nor our senses can ever assure us of anything if our understanding does not intervene in it. Finally, if there are still men who are not sufficiently persuaded of the existence of God and of their souls for the reasons I have given, I am willing that they should know that all the other things of which they think themselves perhaps more assured, such as having a body, and that there are stars and an earth and similar things, are less certain. For, although we have a moral assurance of these things, which is such that it seems that unless we are extravagant we cannot doubt it, yet also unless we are unreasonable when we speak of a metaphysical certainty, we cannot deny that it is not enough of a subject not to be entirely sure of it, to have taken care that we can in the same way imagine it, being asleep, that one has another body and sees other stars and another earth, without this being the case. For how do we know that the thoughts that come in dreams are rather false than others, seeing that they are often no less vivid and express? And let the best minds study it as much as they please, I do not believe that they can give any reason that is sufficient to remove this doubt, if they do not presuppose the existence of God. For, in the first place, the very thing which I have just taken for a rule, namely, that the things which we can see very clearly and distinctly are all true, is only certain because God is or exists, and is a perfect being, and that all that is in us comes from Him, whence it follows that our ideas or notions, being real things and coming from God, in all that they are clear and distinct, can only be true in this respect. So that if we have some that often contain falsehood, it can only be of those which have something confused and obscure, because in this they partake of nothingness, that is to say, they are thus confused in us only because we are not all perfect. And it is evident that there is no less repugnance that falsehood or imperfection proceeds from God as such, than there is that truth or perfection proceeds from nothing. But if we did not know that all that is real and true in us comes from a perfect and infinite being, however clear and distinct our ideas might be, we should have no reason to assure us that they had the perfection of being true. Now, after the knowledge of God and the soul has thus made us certain of this rule, it is very easy to know that the reveries which we imagine while asleep should not make us doubt the truth of the thoughts we have while awake. For if it were even in his sleep that some very distinct idea was entertained, as, for example, that a geometer invented some new demonstration, his sleep would not prevent it from being true. And as for the most common error of our dreams, which consists in representing to us various objects in the same way as our external senses do, it does not matter if it gives us occasion to distrust the truth of such ideas, because they may also deceive us often enough without our sleeping. As when those who have jaundice see everything yellow, or when the stars or other bodies at a great distance appear to us much smaller than they are. For, in short, whether we are awake or asleep, we must never allow ourselves to be persuaded except by the evidence of our reason. And it is to be observed that I say of our reason, and not of our imagination or our senses, as we see the sun very clearly. We must not judge that it is only of the magnitude that we see it, and we may well distinctly imagine a lion's head set on the body of a goat, without it being necessary to conclude that there is a chimera in the world, for reason does not dictate to us that what we see or imagine thus is true, but it does dictate to us that all our ideas or notions must have some foundation of truth, for it would not be possible that God, who is all perfect and all true, would have placed them in us without it, and because our reasonings are never so obvious or so complete during sleep as during wakefulness, although sometimes our imaginations are then as lively or more vivid and express. It also dictates to us that our thoughts cannot all be true, because we are not all perfect, but what truth they have must infallibly be found in those we have while awake rather than in our dreams. Part 5. I should be very glad to continue, and to show here the whole chain of other truths which I have deduced from these first. But because for this purpose it would now be necessary for me to speak of several questions which are in controversy among the learned, with whom I do not wish to quarrel, I think it will be better for me to abstain from them and to say only in general what they are, in order to leave it to the wisest to judge whether it would be useful for the public to be more particularly informed of them. I have always remained firm in the resolution I had taken not to suppose any other principle than that which I have just used to demonstrate the existence of God and the soul, and not to accept anything as true that did not appear to me clearer and more certain than the demonstrations of geometers had previously done. And nevertheless I dare say that not only have I found means of satisfying myself in a short time with regard to all the principal difficulties which are usually treated of in philosophy, but also that I have noticed certain laws which God has so established in nature, and of which he has impressed such notions on our souls that, after sufficient reflection, we cannot doubt that they are exactly observed in all that is or is done in the world. Then, in considering the sequence of these laws, I seem to have discovered several truths more useful and important than anything I had previously learned, or even hoped to learn. But, as I have endeavoured to explain the principal ones in a treatise which some considerations prevent me from publishing, I could not better make them known than by stating here briefly what it contains. I intended to understand in it all that I thought I knew before I wrote again concerning the nature of material things. But, just as painters, not being able to represent equally well in a flat picture all the various faces of a solid body, choose one of the principal ones, which they put alone towards the light, and, shading the others, make them appear only as far as they can be seen by looking at it, so, fearing that I should not be able to put into my discourse all that I had thought, I only undertook to set forth in it very amply what I conceived of the light, then, on its occasion, to add something of the sun and the fixed stars, because it proceeds almost all of them from heaven, because they transmit it, of the planets, of comets, and of the earth, because they make it reflect, and in particular of all bodies that are on earth, because they are either coloured, or transparent, or luminous, and finally of man, because he is the spectator. Even in order to overshadow all these things a little, and be able to say more freely what I thought of them, without being obliged to follow or refute the opinions which are received among the learned, I resolved to leave all these people here to their disputes, and to speak only of what would happen in a new one. If God were now to create somewhere in imaginary spaces enough matter to compose it, and if he were to agitate the various parts of this matter variously and without order, so that he would compose a chaos as confused as poets can feign, and that afterwards he would do nothing else than lend his usual assistance to nature, and let it act according to the laws he has established. Thus, in the first place, I described this matter, and endeavoured to represent it as there is nothing in the world, it seems to me, clearer or more intelligible, except what has been said just now of God and the soul. For I even expressly supposed that there was in it none of those forms or qualities of which it is disputed in the schools, nor generally anything the knowledge of which was not so natural to our souls that we could not even pretend to be ignorant of it. Moreover, I showed what were the laws of nature, and without basing my reasons on any other principle than on the infinite perfections of God, I endeavoured to demonstrate all those of which there might have been some doubt, and to show that they are such that, although God had created several worlds, there could be none in which they failed to be observed. After this, I showed how the greater part of the matter of this chaos must, in consequence of these laws, be disposed and arranged in a certain way which made it like our heavens. How, however, some of its parts were to compose an earth, and some of the planets and comets, and some others a sun and fixed stars. And here, enlarging on the subject of light, I explained at length what was to be found in the sun and the stars, and how from thence it traversed in an instant the immense spaces of the heavens, and how it was reflected from the planets and comets to the earth. I also added to it several things concerning the substance, the situation, the motions, and all the various qualities of these heavens and stars, so that I thought I could say enough to show that there is nothing to be noticed in those of this world which ought not, or at least could not appear, to be quite similar in those of the world which I described. From this I came to speak particularly of the earth, how, although I had expressly supposed that God had put no weight in the matter of which it was composed, all its parts did not fail to tend exactly towards its centre. How, having water and air on its surface, the disposition of the heavens and the stars, especially of the moon, should cause an ebb and flow which was similar in all its circumstances to that which is noticed in our seas, and besides that, a certain course of both water and air, from east to west, as is also observed between the tropics. How mountains, seas, fountains, and rivers could naturally be formed there, and metals could come there in mines, and plants grow in the country. And generally all bodies that are called mixed or compound could be generated there, and, among other things, because after the stars I know nothing in the world but fire which produces light. I studied to make understood very clearly all that belongs to his nature, how it is made, how it is nourished, how it has sometimes only heat without light, and sometimes only light without heat, how he can introduce various colours into different bodies and various other qualities, how he melts some and hardens others, how he can consume almost all of them or convert them into ashes and smoke, and finally how from these ashes, by the mere violence of its action, it forms glass. For this transmutation of ashes into glass seemed to me to be as admirable as any other that takes place in nature. I took particular pleasure in describing it. However, I did not wish to infer from all these things that this world was created in the manner I proposed, for it is much more probable that from the beginning God made it what it should be. But it is certain, and this is an opinion commonly received among theologians, that the action by which he now preserves it is quite the same as that by which he created it. So that even though he would not have given it any other form than that of chaos in the beginning, provided that, having established the laws of nature, he would lend it his assistance in acting as it is customary. All can believe, without injuring the miracle of creation, that by this alone all things which are purely material could in time have come to it as we now see them. And their nature is much easier to conceive when we see them gradually born in this way than when we consider them only ready-made. From the description of inanimate bodies and plants I passed to that of animals, and particularly to that of men. But because I had not yet sufficient knowledge of it to speak of it in the same style as of the rest, that is to say, by demonstrating the effects by the causes, and showing from what seeds and in what manner nature must produce them, I contented myself with supposing that God formed the body of a man entirely like one of us, both in the external figure of its members and in the internal structure of its organs, without composing it of any other matter than that which I have described, and without putting in it at the beginning any rational soul, or anything else to serve as a vegetative or sensitive soul, except that it should excite in its heart one of those fires without light which I have already explained, and that I could conceive of no other nature than that which heats hay when it has been shut up before it is dry, or boils new wines when they are left to vat on the grater. For, examining the functions which might afterwards be in this body, I found in it exactly all those which can be in us without our thinking of them, nor, consequently, that our soul, that is to say, that distinct part of the body, of which it has been said above that nature is only to think, contributes to it, and which are all the same in which we may say that animals without reason resemble us, without my being able to find any of those which, being dependent on thought, are the only ones that belong to us as men, whereas I found them all there afterwards, having supposed that God created a rational soul, and that he joined it to that body in a certain manner which I described. But in order that it may be seen in what manner I treated this matter, I will here put the explanation of the motion of the heart and arteries, which being the first and most general that is observed in animals, it will be easy to judge of it what we should think of all the others. And in order that it may be less difficult to hear what I am going to say about it, I would like those who are not versed in anatomy to take the trouble, before reading this, to have the heart of some large animal that has lungs cut off before them, for it is in all things quite similar to that of man, and let them have shown to them the two chambers or concavities that are there. First, the one on its right side, to which two very large pipes respond, namely the vena cava, which is the principal receptacle of the blood, and like the trunk of the tree, of which all the other veins of the body are the branches, and the arterial vein, which has been so misnamed, because it is in fact an artery, which, taking its origin from the heart, divides after leaving it into several branches which will spread throughout the lungs, then that which is on its left side, to which correspond in the same way two pipes which are as many or wider than the preceding, namely the venous artery, which has also been misnamed, because it is nothing else than a vein which comes from the lungs, where it is divided into several branches interlaced with those of the arterial vein, and those of that duct which is called the whistle, through which the air of respiration enters, and the great artery which, issuing from the heart, sends its branches all over the body. I would also like them to be carefully shown the 11 little skins which, like so many little doors, open and close the 4 openings which are in these 2 concavities, namely 3 at the entrance of the vena cava, where they are so arranged that they can in no way prevent the blood it contains from flowing into the right concavity of the heart, and yet exactly prevent it from leaving it, 3 at the entrance of the arterial vein, which, being disposed on the contrary, allow the blood which is in this concavity to pass into the lungs, but not that which is in the lungs to return there, and thus 2 others at the entrance of the venous artery, which allow the blood to flow from the lungs to the left concavity of the heart, but oppose its return, and 3 at the entrance of the great artery, which allow it to leave the heart, but prevent it from returning to it. And there is no need to look for any other reason for the number of these skins, except that the opening of the venous artery being oval, on account of the place where it meets, can be conveniently closed with 2, whereas the others being round, can be better with 3. Moreover, I would like them to be made to consider that the great artery and the arterial vein are of a much harder and firmer composition than are the venous artery and the vena cava, and that these last two enlarge before they enter the heart, and there make two pouches called the ears of the heart, which are composed of a flesh similar to his own, and that there is always more warmth in the heart than in any other part of the body. And finally, that this heat is capable of causing it, if any drop of blood enters its concavities, to swell quickly and expand, as all liquors generally do, when they are dropped, drop by drop, into some vessel which is very hot. For, after this, I need say nothing else to explain the movement of the heart, except that when its concavities are not full of blood, there must flow from the vena cava in the right, and from the venous artery in the left, especially as these two vessels are always full of it, and their openings, which look towards the heart, cannot then be stopped. But that as soon as 2 drops of blood have thus entered, one in each of its concavities, these drops, which can only be very large, because the openings through which they enter are very large, and the vessels from which they come very full of blood, become rarefied and dilated because of the heat they find there, by means of which, causing the whole heart to swell, they push open and close the 5 small doors which are at the entrances of the 2 vessels from which they come, thus preventing any more blood from descending into the heart, and continuing to become more and more scarce. They push and open the 6 other small doors which are at the entrances of the other 2 vessels by which they exit, causing by this means all the branches of the arterial vein and the great artery to swell, almost at the same instant as the heart, which immediately afterwards becomes swollen, as these arteries also do, because the blood that has entered them cools in them. And their 6 little doors are closed, and the 5 of the vena cava and the venous artery are reopened, and give passage to 2 other drops of blood, which again cause the heart and arteries to swell, just as the previous ones. And because the blood which enters the heart in this way passes through these 2 pouches which are called its ears, hence their movement is contrary to his, and that they are swollen when he swells. Moreover, in order that those who do not know the force of mathematical demonstrations, and are not accustomed to distinguish true reasons from probables, may not venture to deny this without examining it, I wish to warn them that this movement which I have just explained also necessarily follows from the sole disposition of the organs which can be seen by the eye in the heart, and of the heat that can be felt with the fingers, and of the nature of the blood that can be known by experience, which that of a clock makes, of the strength, situation, and figure of its counterweights and wheels. But if it be asked how the blood of the veins is not exhausted, by thus continually flowing into the heart, and how the arteries are not too full of it, since every one who passes through the heart goes there, I need not answer anything other than what has already been written by a physician of England, to whom we must give the praise of having broken the ice in this place, and of being the first who taught that there are several small passages at the ends of the arteries, through which the blood which they receive from the heart enters the small branches of the veins, whence it goes again to the heart, so that its course is nothing but a perpetual circulation. This he proves very well by the ordinary experience of surgeons, who, having tied the arm moderately strong above the place where they open the vein, cause the blood to come out more abundantly than if they had not bound it, and it would be quite the opposite if they tied it below between the hand and the opening, or if they tied it very tightly above. For it is manifest that the bond, which is not very tight, and which can prevent the blood which is already in the arm from returning to the heart through the veins, does not prevent it from always coming back through the arteries, because they are situated below the veins, and their skins, being harder, are less easy to press, and also that the blood that comes from the heart tends with more force to pass through them to the hand than it does to return thence to the heart through the veins. And since this blood comes out of the arm through the opening in one of the veins, there must necessarily be some passages below the place, that is to say, towards the extremities of the arm, through which arteries can come there. He also proves very well what he says about the course of the blood by certain small skins, which are so arranged in various places along the veins, that they do not allow him to pass through them from the middle of the body to the extremities, but only to return from the extremities to the heart. And moreover by the experiment which shows that every one who is in the body can leave it in a very short time by a single artery when it is cut, even though it is closely connected very close to the heart, and cut between it and the bond, so that there was no reason to imagine that the blood that would come out of it came from elsewhere. But there are several other things which testify that the true cause of this movement of the blood is that which I have said. As, in the first place, the difference which is observed between that which comes out of the veins and that which comes out of the arteries can only proceed from the fact that, being rarefied and as it were distilled by passing through the heart, it is more subtle and more lively and warmer incontinent after leaving it, that is to say, being in the arteries, that it is only a little ahead of entering them, that is to say, being in the veins. And if we take care of it, we will find that this difference appears only towards the heart, and not so much in the places that are the furthest from it. Then the hardness of the skins of which the arterial vein and the great artery are composed sufficiently shows that the blood beats against them with more force than against the veins. And why should the left concavity of the heart and the great artery be wider and wider than the right concavity and the arterial vein, if it were not that the blood of the venous artery, having been only in the lungs since it passed through the heart, is more subtle and rarefied stronger and more easily than that which comes immediately from the vena cava? And what can physicians guess by feeling the pulse, if they do not know that, according as the nature of the blood changes, it may be rarefied by the heat of the heart, more or less strong, and more or less vile than before? And if we examine how this heat is communicated to the other members, must we not admit that it is by means of the blood, which, passing through the heart, is warmed there, and thence spreads through the whole body, whence it follows that if the blood is removed from any part, the heat is removed by the same means. And even if the heart were as ardent as a burning iron, it would not be sufficient to warm the feet and hands as long as it does, if it did not continually send forth new blood. Then also we know from this that the true use of respiration is to bring enough fresh air into the lungs to cause the blood which comes there from the right concavity of the heart, where it has been rarefied and as it were changed into vapours, to thicken and convert into blood again before falling back into the left. Otherwise it could not be fit to serve as food for the fire there, which is confirmed by the fact that animals which have no lungs also have only one concavity in the heart, and that children, who cannot use it while they are shut up in their mother's wombs, have an opening through which blood flows from the vena cava into the left concavity of the heart, and a conduit through which it comes from the arterial vein into the great artery, without passing through the lung. Then how would coction take place in the stomach, if the heart did not send heat through the arteries, and with this some of the most flowing parts of the blood, which help to dissolve the meats that have been put into it? And is not the action which converts the juice of these meats into blood easy to know, if we consider that it is distilled, passing through and repassing through the heart, perhaps more than 100 or 200 times in each day? And what else is needed to explain the nutrition and production of the various humours which are in the body, but to say that the force with which the blood, in becoming rarefied, passes from the heart to the extremities of the arteries, causes some of its parts to stop between those of the limbs in which they are found, and take the place of some others whom they drive out, and that, according to the situation or the figure or the smallness of the pores they encounter, some will go to certain places rather than others, in the same way that everyone may have seen various sieves, which, being variously pierced, serve to separate different grains from each other. And finally, what is most remarkable in all this is the generation of animal spirits, which are like a very subtle wind, or rather like a very pure and very lively flame, which, continually rising in great abundance from the heart into the brain, will return thence through the nerves into the muscles, and gives movement to all the members, without it being necessary to imagine any other cause which causes the parts of the blood which, being the most agitated and penetrating, are the most suitable for composing these spirits, to go rather to the brain than to elsewhere, except that the arteries which carry them there are those which come from the heart most in a straight line of all, and that, according to the rules of mechanics, which are the same as those of nature, when several things tend together to move towards the same side where there is not enough room for all, as the parts of the blood which issue from the left concavity of the heart tend towards the brain, the weakest and less agitated must be diverted from it by the stronger, who by this means go there alone. I had explained all these things in a rather particular way in the treatise which I had previously intended to publish, and then I showed what must be the manufacture of the nerves and muscles of the human body, in order that the animal's spirits being in it have the strength to move its limbs, as we see that the heads, a little after being cut off, move again and bite the earth, notwithstanding that they are no longer animated. What changes must be made in the brain to cause wakefulness, sleep, and dreams? How light, sounds, smells, tastes, heat, and all the other qualities of external objects can impress various ideas on them through the intermediary of the senses. How hunger, thirst, and other interior passions can also send theirs there. What must be taken for the common sense in which these ideas are received, for the memory which preserves them, and for the fancy which can variously change them and compose new ones, and, by the same means, distributing the animal spirits in the muscles, make the members of this body move in as many different ways, and as much about the objects that present themselves to his senses and the interior passions that are in him, that ours can move without the will leading them, which will not seem strange to those who, knowing how many different automatons or moving machines the industry of men can make, without employing but very few parts, in comparison with the great multitude of bones, muscles, nerves, arteries, veins, and all the other parts that are in the body of every animal, will consider this body as a machine, which, having been made by the hands of God, is incomparably better ordered. and has in itself more admirable movements than any that can be invented by men. And here I was particularly careful to show that if there were such machines which had the organs and external figure of an ape or some other animal without reason, we should have no means of recognizing that they would not be in all the same nature as these animals, whereas if there were any who had the likeness of our bodies and imitated our actions as much as morally it would be possible, we would always have two very certain means of recognizing that they would not be true men for that reason. The first of which is that they could never use words or other signs in composing them, as we do to declare our thoughts to others, for it may well be conceivable that a machine is so made that it utters words, and even utters some words about bodily actions which will cause some change in its organs, as if it is touched in any place. It asks what is meant to be said to it, if, in another, that she cries out that she is hurt, and the like, but not that it arranges them in different ways to respond to the meaning of all that will be said in its presence, as the most dazed men can do. And the second is that, although they do many things as well, or perhaps better than any of us, they would infallibly fail in some others, by which it would be discovered that they would not act from knowledge, but only from the disposition of their organs, for, instead of reason being a universal instrument that can serve in all kinds of encounters, these organs need some particular disposition for each particular action, whence it comes that it is morally impossible that there should be enough different in a machine to make it act in all the occurrences of life in the same way as our reason makes us act. Now, by these two same means, we can also know the difference between men and beasts, for it is a very remarkable thing that there are no men so stupefied and stupid, not excepting even fools, that they are not able to arrange various words together, and to compose a discourse from them by which they make their thoughts heard. And that, on the contrary, there is no other animal, however perfect and however happily born it may be, that does the like. This does not happen because they have no organs, for it is seen that magpies and parrots can speak words as we do, and yet cannot speak as we do, that is, by testifying that they mean what they say. Whereas men who, being born deaf and dumb, are deprived of the organs which serve others to speak, as much or more than beasts, are accustomed to invent of their own accord some signs, by which they make themselves heard by those who, being ordinarily with them, have leisure to learn their language. And this not only testifies that beasts have less reason than men, but that they have none at all, for it is seen that it requires very little to know how to speak. And inasmuch as there is inequality between animals of the same species, as well as between men, and as the one is easier to train than the other, it is not to be believed that a monkey or a parrot who would be one of the most perfect of his species should not equal in this a child of the most stupid, or at least a child whose brain would be troubled, if their souls were not of a nature quite different from ours. And words are not to be confounded with natural motions, which testify to the passions, and can be imitated by machines as well as by animals. Nor to think, like some of the ancients, that the beasts speak, although we do not understand their language. For if it were true, since they have several organs which relate to ours, they could as well make themselves heard by us as by their fellows. It is also a very remarkable thing that, although there are many animals that show more industry than we do in some of their actions, yet it is seen that the same animals do not show it at all in many others, so that what they do better than we do does not prove that they have wit, for on this account they would have more than any of us, and would do better in everything else, but rather that they have none, and that it is nature that acts in them according to the arrangement of their organs. As we see that a clock, which is composed only of wheels and springs, can count the hours and measure time more justly than we do with all our prudence. I had after this described the rational soul, and showed that it can in no way be drawn from the power of matter, like the other things of which I have spoken, but that it must expressly be created, and how it is not enough that it should be lodged in the human body as a pilot in his ship, if not perhaps to move its limbs, but that it is necessary that it should be joined and united more closely with it, in order to have besides that sentiments and appetites similar to ours, and thus compose a true man. For the rest, I have here dwelt a little on the subject of the soul, because it is one of the most important. For after the error of those who deny God, which I think I have sufficiently refuted above, there is none that rather distances weak minds from the right path of virtue, than to imagine that the souls of beasts are of the same nature as ours, and that consequently we have nothing to fear or hope for after this life, any more than flies and ants. Whereas when we know how different they are, we understand much better the reasons which prove that ours is of a nature entirely independent of the body, and consequently that it is not subject to die with it. Then, inasmuch as we see no other causes that destroy it, we are naturally inclined to judge from this that it is immortal. Part 6. Now it is now 3 years since I had come to the end of the treatise which contains all these things, and began to review it in order to put it in the hands of a printer. When I learned that of the persons to whom I defer, and whose authority can scarcely less over my actions than my own reason over my thoughts, had disapproved of an opinion of physics published a little before by some other, of which I do not wish to say that I was a member, but although I had not noticed anything in it before their censure, which I could imagine to be prejudicial either to religion or to the state, nor consequently which would have prevented me from writing it if reason had persuaded me of it, and that this made me fear that there might be found none among my own in whom I had been mistaken, notwithstanding the great care I have always taken not to receive any news of them in my belief of which I had not very certain demonstrations, and not to write any that might turn to the disadvantage of anyone. This was sufficient to oblige me to change the resolution I had had to publish them, for, although the reasons for which I had taken it before were very strong, my inclination, which has always made me hate the trade of making books, made me incontinent find others enough to excuse myself for it. And these reasons on both sides are such that not only do I have some interest here in saying them, but perhaps also that the public has some interest in knowing them. I have never made much of the state of things that came from my mind, and while I have reaped no other fruits of the method I use, except that I have satisfied myself with some difficulties which belong to the speculative sciences, or that I have tried to regulate my morals by the reasons it taught me, I have not thought myself obliged to write anything about it. For as far as morals are concerned, everyone agrees so strongly that there might be as many reformers as there are heads, if it were permitted to others than those whom God has appointed as rulers over his people, or to whom he has given grace and zeal enough to be prophets, to undertake to change anything, and although my speculations were more pleasing to me, I thought that others had also speculations that perhaps pleased them more. But as soon as I had acquired some general notions concerning physics, and began to test them in various particular difficulties, I noticed how far they can lead, and how different they are from the principles hitherto used. I thought that I could not keep them hidden without greatly sinning against the law which obliges us to procure as much as is in us the general good of all men. For they have made me see that it is possible to arrive at knowledge that is very useful to life, and that instead of that speculative philosophy which is taught in the schools, we may find a practice of it, by which, knowing the force and actions of fire, water, air, the stars, the heavens, and all the other bodies that surround us, as distinctly as we know the various trades of our artisans, we could employ them in the same way for all the uses for which they are suited, and thus make ourselves masters and possessors of nature. This is not only to be desired for the invention of an infinite number of artifices, which would make it possible to enjoy, without any difficulty, the fruits of the earth and all the comforts that are found therein, but mainly also for the preservation of health, which is undoubtedly the first good and the foundation of all the other goods of this life, for even the mind depends so much on the temperament and disposition of the organs of the body, that, if it is possible to find any means which will commonly make men wiser and more skilful than they have hitherto been, I believe that it is in medicine that it must be sought. It is true that the one now in use contains few things of such remarkable utility, but, without my having any design to despise it, I assure myself that there is no one, even of those who profess it, who does not confess that all that is known in it is almost nothing in comparison with what remains to be known in it, and that we could exempt ourselves from an infinity of diseases both of body and mind, and even perhaps also from the weakening of old age, if we had sufficient knowledge of their causes and of all the remedies with which nature has provided us. Now, having a design to employ my whole life in the search for a science so necessary, and having met with a path which seems to me such that it must infallibly be found by following it, unless one is prevented from doing so either by the brevity of life or by the defect of experience, I judged that there was no better remedy against these two impediments than to communicate faithfully to the public all the little I had, and to invite good minds to try to go further, by contributing, each according to his inclination and power, to the experiments that should be made, and also communicating to the public all the things they would learn, so that the last ones may begin where the previous ones would have ended, and thus joining the lives and labours of many. We all went much further together than each one in particular could do. I even remarked, concerning experiments, that they are all the more necessary the more advanced one is in knowledge. For the beginning, it is better to make use of only those which present themselves to our senses, and which we cannot ignore, provided we give us a little thought to them, than to look for rarer and more studied ones, the reason of which is that these rarest often deceive, when we do not yet know the causes of the most common, and that the circumstances on which they depend are almost always so particular and so small that it is very difficult to notice them. But the order I have kept in this has been such. In the first place, I have endeavoured to find in general the principles or first causes of all that is or can be in the world, without considering anything for this purpose but God alone who created it, nor drawing them from any other than certain seeds of truths which are naturally in our souls. After this I have examined what were the first and most ordinary effects that could be deduced from these causes, And it seems to me that by this I have found heavens, stars, and earth, and even on the earth water, air, fire, minerals, and some other such things which are the most common of all and the simplest, and consequently the easiest to know. Then, when I wished to descend to those which were more particular, so many different ones presented themselves to me, that I could not believe that it was possible for the human mind to distinguish the forms or species of bodies which are on the earth from an infinity of others which might be there, if it had been the will of God to put them there, nor consequently to relate them to our use, except that we come to anticipate causes by effects and make use of several particular experiments. Wherefore, turning my mind over all the objects that had ever presented themselves to my senses, I dare say that I noticed nothing in them that I could not easily enough explain by the principles I had found. But I must also confess that the power of nature is so ample and so vast, and that these principles are so simple and general, that I hardly notice any particular effect that I do not know at first that it can be deduced from them in several different ways, and that my greatest difficulty is usually to find in which of these ways it depends. For I know of no other expedient than to seek again some experiments which are such that their event is not the same if it is in one of these ways that it is to be explained as if it is in the other. For the rest, I am now at this point, which I see, it seems to me, fairly well the bias of making most of those that can be used for this purpose. But I also see that they are such, and in such great number, that neither my hands nor my income, although I had 1,000 times more than I have, would not be sufficient for all. So that, according as I shall henceforth have the convenience of doing more or less, I shall also advance more or less in the knowledge of nature, which I promised myself to make known by the treatise I had written, and to show so clearly the utility that the public can receive from it, that I would oblige all those who desire the good of men in general, that is to say, all those who are in fact virtuous, and not by false pretence or only by opinion, both in communicating to me those which they have already done, and in helping me in the search for those which remain to be done. But since that time I have had other reasons which have made me change my opinion, and think that I ought really to continue to write down all the things that I should judge of any importance, as I should discover the truth of them, and to take the same care as if I wished to have them printed, so much so that I might have the more opportunity of examining them well, as no doubt. One always looks more closely at what one believes should be seen by many than at what one does only for oneself, and often the things which seemed to me true when I began to conceive them appeared to me false when I wanted to put them on paper, only in order not to lose any opportunity of benefiting the public, if I am able to do so, and if my writings are worth anything. Those who have them after my death may use them as is most proper, but that I ought not to consent to their being published during my life, in order that neither the oppositions and controversies to which they might be subject, nor even the reputation such as they might acquire for me, should give me any opportunity of wasting the time I intend to employ in instructing myself. For although it is true that every man is obliged to procure as much as he is in himself the good of others, and that it is properly worth nothing to be useful to no one, yet it is also true that our cares should extend beyond the present time, and that it is well to omit those things which would perhaps bring some benefit to those who live, when it is on purpose to make others that bring more to our nephews. For as I am willing to let it be known that the little I have learned so far is almost nothing in comparison with what I do not know, and that I do not despair of being able to learn, for it is almost the same of those who discover the truth little by little in the sciences, as of those who, beginning to become rich, have less difficulty in making great acquisitions than they had before, being poorer in making much smaller ones. Or they may be compared to the commanders of armies, whose forces are accustomed to increase in proportion to their victories, and who require more conduct to maintain themselves after the loss of a battle than they have, after having won it, to take cities and provinces, for it is truly giving battles, to endeavour to overcome all the difficulties and errors which prevent us from arriving at the knowledge of the battle. And it is to lose one of them to receive any false opinion concerning a matter that is a little general and important. It requires much more skill to restore oneself to the same state as one was before than it takes to make great progress when one already has principles that are assured. For my part, if I have previously found some truths in the sciences, and I hope that the things contained in this volume will make it possible to judge that I have found some of them, I can say that they are only the consequences and dependencies of 5 or 6 principal difficulties that I have overcome, and that I count as many battles in which I have had the good fortune on my side. I will not hesitate to say that I think I only need to gain 2 or 3 others of the same kind to accomplish my designs entirely, and that my age is not so advanced that, according to the ordinary course of nature, I cannot yet have leisure enough for this purpose. But I think I am all the more obliged to spare the time that remains to me, as I have more hope of being able to use it well, and I should doubtless have several opportunities of losing it if I publish the foundations of my physics. For, although they are almost all so obvious that it is only necessary to hear them to believe them, and there is none of which I do not think I can give demonstrations yet. Because it is impossible for them to agree with all the different opinions of other men, I foresee that I should often be entertained by the oppositions which they would give rise to. It may be said that these oppositions would be useful, both to make me aware of my faults, and that, if I had anything good, others might by that means have more understanding of it, and, as many can see more than a single man, that, beginning to make use of it now, they should also help me with their inventions. But although I acknowledge myself extremely liable to fail, and that I scarcely ever trust the first thoughts that come to me, yet the experience I have of the objections that may be made to me prevents me from hoping for any benefit from them. For I have already often experienced the judgments of those whom I have held for my friends, as well as of some others to whom I thought I was indifferent, and even of some of whom I knew that malignity and envy would try enough to discover what affection would hide from my friends. But it has seldom happened that I have been objected to something that I had not foreseen at all, except that it was very far from my subject, so that I have scarcely ever met with any censor of my opinions who did not seem to me either less rigorous or less equitable than myself. Nor have I ever observed that, by means of the disputes which are practised in the schools, no truth has been discovered which was previously unknown. For while each one is trying to conquer, they are much more exercised in asserting probability than in weighing the reasons on both sides, and those who have long been good advocates are not for that reason better judges. As for the usefulness that others would receive from the communication of my thoughts, it could not be very great, especially as I have not yet carried them so far that it is not necessary to add many things to them before applying them to use. And I think I can say without vanity that if there is anyone who is capable of this, it must rather be me than any other. Not that there may not be in the world several minds incomparably better than mine, but because one cannot so well conceive a thing and make it one's own when one learns it from another, which is so true in this matter, that, though I have often explained some of my opinions to persons of very good mind, who, while I was speaking to them, seemed to hear them very distinctly, yet, when they repeated them, I observed that they almost always changed them in such a way that I could no longer confess them for my own. On the occasion of which I am very glad to beg our nephews here never to believe that the things that are said to them come from me, when I have not divulged them myself, and I am not in the least surprised at the extravagances attributed to all those ancient philosophers whose writings we have not possessed. Nor do I judge that their thoughts were very unreasonable, seeing that they were of the best minds of their time, but only that they have been badly reported to us. As we see also that it has almost never happened that any of their followers has surpassed them, and I am sure that the most passionate of those who now follow Aristotle would think themselves happy if they had as much knowledge of nature as he had, even if it were on condition that they would never have more. They are like ivy, which does not tend to rise higher than the trees that support it, and often even descends again after it has reached their summit, for it seems to me also that those who descend again, that is to say, make themselves in some way less learned than if they abstained from studying, who, not content with knowing all that is intelligibly explained in their author, wish, in addition to this, the solution of several difficulties of which he says nothing, and of which he has perhaps never thought of it. However, their way of philosophizing is very convenient for those who have only very mediocre minds, for the obscurity of the distinctions and principles they use is the cause that they can speak of all things as boldly as if they knew them, and support all that they say about them against the most subtle and clever, without any means of convincing them, in which they seem to me like a blind man who, to fight without disadvantage against one who sees, would have brought him to the bottom of some very dark cellar. And I can say that it is in their interest that I abstain from publishing the principles of the philosophy I use, for being very simple and very obvious, as they are, I would do almost the same in publishing them as if I were to open a few windows and let daylight into the cellar where they have descended to fight. But even the best minds have no occasion to wish to know them, for if they wish to know how to speak of all things and to acquire the reputation of being learned, they will more easily attain this by being content with verisimilitude, which can be found without great difficulty in all sorts of subjects, than by seeking the truth, which is only gradually discovered in some, and which, when it is a question of speaking of others, obliges one to confess frankly that one does not know them. That if they prefer the knowledge of a few truths to the vanity of appearing to be ignorant of nothing, as doubtless is much preferable, and wish to follow a design similar to mine, they need not for this reason that I should say anything more to them than what I have already said in this discourse. For if they are able to go beyond it more than I have done, they will also be more inclined to find of themselves all that I think I have found, especially as, having never examined anything except by orders, it is certain that what still remains for me to discover is of itself more difficult and more hidden than what I have been able to meet with before, and they would have much less pleasure in learning it from me than from themselves, besides that the habit they acquire by seeking at first easy things and passing little by degrees to others more difficult, will serve them more than all my instructions can do. As for myself, I am persuaded that if I had been taught from my youth all the truths of which I have since sought the demonstrations, and had had no difficulty in learning them, I should perhaps never have known any others. And, at least, that I should never have acquired the habit and facility that I think I have of always finding new ones as I apply myself to seek them. And, in a word, if there is any work in the world that cannot be so well finished by any other than by the same who began it, it is the one I am working on. It is true that as regards the experiments that can be of use to it, a man alone would not be sufficient to make them all. But he could also usefully employ other hands than his own, except those of the artisans, or such people as he could pay, and to whom the hope of gain, which is a very effective means, would have all the things he prescribed them do exactly. For as for the volunteers who, out of curiosity or a desire to learn, would perhaps offer to help him, besides the fact that they usually have more promises than effects, and that they make only fine proposals, none of which ever succeeds, they would infallibly want to be paid by the explanation of some difficulties, or at least by compliments and useless conversations, which could not cost him so little of his time that he would not lose it. And as for the experiments which others have already made, even if they wish to communicate them to him, which those who call them secrets would never do, they are for the most part composed of so many superfluous circumstances or ingredients that it would be very difficult for him to decipher the truth of them, besides that he would find almost all of them so badly explained or even so false, because those who made them have endeavoured to make them appear to be in conformity with their principles, that if there were some of them that were useful to him, they could not again be worth the time he would have to employ in choosing them. So that if there were anyone in the world who was surely known to be capable of finding the greatest and most useful things to the public, that could be. And that for this reason other men were to endeavour by every means to help him to accomplish his designs, I do not see that they could do anything else for him, if not to furnish at the expense experiments which he might need, and moreover to prevent his leisure from being taken away from him by the importunity of any one. But, besides the fact that I do not presume so much of myself as to wish to promise anything extraordinary, nor do I feast on thoughts so vain as to imagine that the public ought to take a great interest in my designs, I am not so low in soul that I would accept from anyone any favour that might be thought that I had not deserved. All these considerations joined together were the cause 3 years ago of my refusing to divulge the treatise which I had in my hands, and even of my resolution not to show any other during my life which was so general, nor from which the foundations of my physics could be understood. But there have since been 2 other reasons which have obliged me to put here some particular essays, and to give the public some account of my actions and designs. The first is, that if I fail to do so, many, who have known the intention I had before of having some writings printed, might imagine that the causes for which I abstain from them would be more to my disadvantage than they are. For, although I do not love glory to excess, or even, if I may say so, hate it in so far as I judge it contrary to repose, whom I esteem above all things, yet I have never tried to conceal my actions as crimes. Nor have I used many precautions to be unknown, both because I thought I was doing myself wrong, as because it would have given me some kind of uneasiness, which would again have been contrary to the perfect peace of mind which I seek, and because, having always thus kept myself indifferent between the care of being known or not, I could not prevent me from acquiring some sort of reputation, I thought that I ought to do my best to exempt myself at least from having it bad. The other reason which has obliged me to write this is seeing every day more and more the delay in the design I have of educating myself on account of an infinity of experiences which I need, and that it is impossible for me to do without the help of others, although I do not flatter myself so much as to hope that the public will take a great part in my interests, however. I do not wish to fail so much in myself as to give cause to those who will survive me to reproach me some day that I might have left them many things much better than I would have done, if I had not neglected too much to make them understand in what way they could contribute to my designs. And I thought it easy for me to choose some subjects which, without being subject to much controversy, nor obliging me to declare more of my principles than I desire, would not fail to show clearly enough what I can or cannot in the sciences, in which I cannot say whether I have succeeded, and I do not wish to forestall the judgments of anyone, by speaking myself of my writings, but I shall be very glad to have them examined, and in order that we may have all the more opportunity of them, I beg all those who have any objections to make to them to take the trouble to send them to my bookseller, by whom, being informed, I will try to enclose my answer at the same time, and by this means the readers, seeing both, together will judge the more easily of the truth, for I do not promise ever to make long answers to them, but only to confess my faults very frankly if I know them, or if I cannot perceive them. to simply say what I think required for the defence of the things I have written, without adding to it the explanation of any new matter, so as not to commit myself endlessly from one to the other. That if some of those of which I spoke at the beginning of the dioptric and the meteora are at first shocking, because I call them suppositions, and do not seem to have a desire to prove them, let us have the patience to read the whole with attention, and I hope that we will be satisfied with it. For it seems to me that the reasons are in such a way intertwined, that as the latter are demonstrated by the former, which are their causes, so the former reciprocally by the latter, which are their effects. And it must not be imagined that I commit in this the fault which logicians call a circle, for experience rendering most of these effects very certain. The causes from which I deduce them serve not so much to prove them as to explain them, but, on the contrary, they are the ones that are proved by them, and I have named them suppositions only in order that it may be known that I think I can deduce them from these first truths which I have explained above, but that I expressly wish not to do so, in order to prevent certain minds, who imagine that they know in one day all that another has thought in 20 years, as soon as he has only said 2 or 3 words to them, and who are all the more liable to fail and less capable of the truth as they are more penetrating and more lively, cannot take occasion from this to build some extravagant philosophy on what they believe to be my principles. And let them be attributed to me the fault of it. For as for the opinions which are all mine, I do not excuse them as new, especially as, if the reasons for them are well considered, I am sure that they will be found so simple and so conformable to common sense, that they will seem less extraordinary and less strange than any other that can be had on the same subject. Nor do I boast of being the first inventor of any of them, but rather that I have never received them, either because they have been said by others, or because they have not been so, but only because reason has persuaded me of them. That if the craftsman cannot immediately execute the invention which is explained in the dioptric, I do not believe that it can be said to be bad for that reason. For, inasmuch as it requires skill and habit to make and adjust the machines I have described, without missing any circumstance, I should not be less astonished if they met at the first attempt. That if someone could learn in one day to play the lute excellently, by the mere fact that he had been given tablature, that would be good. And if I write in French, which is the language of my country, rather than in Latin, which is that of my tutors, it is because I hope that those who use only their pure natural reason will judge better of my opinions than those who believe only in ancient books. And as for those who combine good sense with study, which alone I wish for my judges, they will not, I am sure, be so partial in Latin that they refuse to listen to my reasons because I explain them in the vulgar language. For the rest, I do not wish to speak here in particular of the progress I hope to make in the future in the sciences, nor to commit myself to the public of any promise that I am not sure of fulfilling, but I will only say that I have resolved not to employ the time that remains to me in living for anything other than to try to acquire some knowledge of nature which will be such that we can draw from it rules for medicine, more certain than those we have had until now, and that my inclination distances me so far from all sorts of other designs, especially from those which could only be useful to some by injuring others, that if some occasion compelled me to employ myself in them, I do not believe that I would be capable of succeeding in them, of which I make here a statement which I well know cannot serve to make me considerable in the world, but also have no desire to be, and I will always be more obliged to those by whose favour I shall enjoy my leisure without hindrance, than I would be to those who would offer me the most honourable employments on earth. This concludes Discourse on the Method by René Descartes. Thanks for tuning in. Hope to see you again.